And we are recording. First of all, thanks to everyone who is watching this interview with Chris McDowall, creator of the Electric Bastionland and Into the Odd, among other things. Chris, thank you for being here.
No, thank you for having me.
Now, before we go deeper into other things, please tell us about your current projects.
So, as you mentioned, the two sort of RPGs that people might have heard of were Into the Odd and Electric Bastionland. The current project I'm working on is called Mythic Bastionland, and that is a more kind of medieval take on the same system as Electric Bastionland and Into the Odd, with some big new additions and sort of all shunted back to a sort of mythic medieval world. And that's on Kickstarter 7th of November. So I've got that in nice and early.
Agree. I always got the feeling, am I correct in my assessment that Into the Odd is kind of like the past of Electric Bastionland?
Yeah, so it's all left very kind of open, so that if you do just have one, if you just have Into the Odd, you don't need to know what's happening in Electric Bastionland, and if you just have Electric Bastionland, you don't need to know what's happened in Into the Odd. But yeah, the idea is that there's a lot of crossover. They're all based around the same city of Bastion. But yeah, Electric Bastionland is more kind of 20th century feel, like early 20th century, and whereas Into the Odd is kind of like the industrial past of that setting. Yeah. But I like leaving these things kind of open to interpretation of it, so it's not sort of locked in as canon or anything like that.
Okay. Now let's go to your origins story. When did you first started to play tabletop RPGs? How did you get started with this hobby?
So I got started. It's a very, very common story for someone, especially in the UK. When I was sort of 10 years old, I saw another boy at school had brought in some Warhammer miniatures and Warhammer magazines, and I'd never sort of seen anything like this. Like I knew board games like Monopoly and stuff like that, but that was kind of my way into the sort of the wider world of tabletop games. So I played and sort of built Warhammer armies and stuff for a while, but I found myself getting drawn. Well, to start with, I found myself getting pushed away by the rules because I found that the rules were quite complicated, especially when I was sort of 10 or 11 years old. And I was drawn into the games where you could just play with just a few miniatures and sort of do a bit more of a story of just a few characters, like sort of Warhammer Quest, Hero Quest, and things like that. But it took me a while to sort of discover RPGs because I didn't know anyone who played D&D. I knew lots of people who played miniature games, but I didn't know anyone who played role-playing games. So it took me a while, but then with third edition D&D was kind of the way I got into RPGs. And yeah, that's the system that kind of brought me in. And then from there, I sort of realized there were things that I liked about that game and things that I didn't like. So I sort of then sort of spent the next, well, I don't know, 20 years trying to find the perfect RPG and looking through lots of other RPGs that other people were making and just trying as many different things as I can. And I was kind of hooked from that point.
So you could say that you got into RPG design searching for your ideal RPG, right?
Yeah, I think that's what I've tried to do. Is the initially, I think I just ever since I got into these games, even from when I was playing, like I say, when I was playing Warhammer, I always liked sort of playing with the rules a little bit, and sort of whether it was just making my own units and trying to make up some new rules for different models that I had that weren't in the rule book. But yeah, pretty early on, I thought I aside from what I wanted to do, I just knew that I felt a kind of drive to do that and to tinker with the rules. And it wasn't even that I necessarily thought I could make something better than what these designers had made. It was that I just enjoyed the process of playing around with that. And then that all sort of kind of came to a head with what would become Into the Odd, which was when I sort of realized that the style of game that I really enjoyed was the very rules light style of game. I liked games that captured all of the stuff that you imagined when you thought about playing an RPG, all of the stuff that you got excited about, but removed all of the stuff that slowed it down and sort of took you out of the game and kind of made you made you sort of feel like you were playing a numbers game rather than describing the situation that happens at the table and trying to work out what you want to do. So yeah, Into the Odd was kind of my first, the first one that I experimented with enough that it sort of started to feel like something that I really wanted to play myself. And it was a sort of the first one that felt like kind of a real game, if you like. Everything else had kind of felt a bit like experiments at that point.
The first thing that I noticed about Into the Odd is that the character creation system is very simple. You can get started right away, and if your character dies in the middle of the session, you can create a character in probably less than 5 minutes once you are familiar with the process. Did you come up with this process immediately or after thinking long and hard about it? Tell us about that.
So I always liked random character creation because for me, I like the idea of sitting down and not quite knowing what character I was going to get, and then trying to sort of just work with what I got rather than coming into the game with an idea of, oh, here's what I want my character to be like. So I knew that I wanted it to be random character creation, but I had been playing a lot of sort of like basic D&D and a lot of kind of OSR games based around basic D&D and original D&D. And the thing with those games is they are obviously quite deadly, so you can die pretty quickly. But in those games, character creation, it's quick in some ways, but it can be slow in other ways as well. So when you're making a sort of character in old D&D, there's not as much stuff to choose from as, if you're playing modern D&D. But you do still have those things like buying your starting equipment that sort of can slow things down. So the biggest thing for me was removing that shopping phase and kind of having the random equipment packages. And the whole point of so quick character generation is good for two main reasons, really. It's good because it means if you want to play the game tonight, you can sit down and you can start playing the game as soon as possible. But the other thing that's good is when you've got that kind of deadly game like basic D&D, it means that it's much less crushing personally when your character dies, when you know that you can roll another one very quickly. I dread to think what happens. So the one I always think of is Traveller. And I like in classic Traveller, it's quite an involved process to make a character because you have to go through the whole life path procedure. Mm-hmm. And even though it's relatively simple, it takes quite a long time. And I always think like, well, if you haven't got another character prepared and you're playing classic Traveller and your character dies, I would be sad for the character, but I would also be sad because I would think, well, what am I going to do now? I've got to sit and make this character while the rest of the group play. So that's what I wanted to avoid as well. So yeah, the quick character creation, like I say, kind of two things really. It's to make the deaths a bit less crushing and get you playing as quick as possible.
Yes, I think it's very important to consider that when your character dies, it's just a new opportunity to come with an original character concept right away. And Into the Odd allows you to do just that, create your character immediately. Now, I also think that it's great that Into the Odd has all of these features that are open to interpretation. You never have like a hard rule that, oh, this is the only way that you can employ this or that. So tell us about that. When you came with that idea of having features and powers open to interpretation, did you consider it a challenge or just very easy to implement into the system?
So the thing that I always think of as the example here is the way that magic works in Into the Odd is there are like weird magical things around in the world, but the main thing is that there are these items called arcana. And if you have an arcanum, it's generally something that has a kind of power that borders on magic. And they started out as being, so the idea was I wanted every character to be able to engage with the weird magic stuff, not just have it be limited to like wizards. So the magic effects in sort of D&D that always appealed to me were those effects like a wish spell and things like shape-shifting and things like magic items like the unstoppable, it's the immovable rod and the decanter of endless water. These things that they don't really have many rules in terms of the game, it's just you describe it and then everyone knows how it works, really. Like the immovable rod, you press the button and then it's immovable. And obviously this can create lots of questions around, well, what are the limits of this? But I wanted those items to be things that were open to every player character. So putting them in the game, I always had the intention to have those items in the game. So like the thing that I always think of is that the character can start the game with some of these items that are similar to this. Originally there was a bit more of a rules structure around their use, but then I thought, no, what I want to do is I want them to just describe the item, and then the person running the game, the referee, will, if they're confident enough in the system, they will feel confident making these rulings around it. And if the group's talking to each other and the group trusts each other, they'll find a way to make this work. And that's the easy part. It's easy to just say that, but then the key is making sure that you write the items so that they are still interesting. So quite a few times during testing, I would create an item, then just describe something that it did, and it was too useful, so that the group were just using it to every opportunity. So I like to give them a little bit of a limitation or like a weird stipulation to their use. And yeah, that's the way that I like to balance them, rather than through sort of mechanics and uses per day and things like that.
Because you don't want things to feel more like a board game, because in board game you have these hard rules and you cannot go beyond that, because otherwise you are missing out on the competitive experience of a board game. When it comes to tabletop RPGs, everything should be quite open and you should be able to experiment with those items, spells quite freely. I think there is a lot of influence from the Dying Earth in Into the Odd. Have you ever read that book, or rather the saga?
No, I know of them, but I've never actually sat and read any of the books. But I'm terrible at reading novels. I'm very good at starting novels, and then I'm very bad at finishing reading them. So lots of times people will say to me, "Oh, this part of Into the Odd is clearly inspired by some book that I've like not read," and I have to sort of be like, "Oh, sorry, I've not read it." But I think because I read so many games and blogs and by other people who are much more well-read than me, I think I've kind of absorbed a lot of stuff secondhand. So I think I have picked that kind of stuff up through a kind of game lens, if you like. But no, funnily enough, in terms of actual novels, I'm much more inspired by other games than I am by sort of specific novels and films and things like that.
Are you inspired by visual art as well? Because one of the things that I love about Electric Bastionland and Into the Odd is the art, the graphic design, the illustrations. It looks perfect. How involved were you with the process itself?
So with Electric Bastionland, that was the first one that I did where I sort of actually commissioned artwork for it. So Alex Sorensen came on to do the artwork for Electric Bastionland, and I knew that I wanted one person to do the art for the whole book, because I really like books that have that very particular identity of one artist, and you can kind of see it through the whole book. It's got the same sort of consistency, and I was very involved. But to be honest, I didn't give Alec loads of brief for each piece, so he was most of the pieces were illustrate. In fact, they're these pieces that are on my wall. Most of the pieces were illustrations for the failed careers, which are the different sort of almost like classes or character backgrounds that your character would have. And I'd written up what you got as part of that character background and a little bit of like fluff text, and then just kind of we spent a lot of time discussing the general look of Electric Bastionland, but then I very much let him run with it and discover sort of his own vision of the setting. And it was different to what I was picturing, but I really liked that it ended up as this thing that was like a collaboration sort of thing, where it wasn't just me saying to him, "Oh no, it needs to look this way, this way, this way." It was kind of his vision of that setting. But in terms of visual art for that one, so one of the artists that I knew I wanted to kind of be a factor in there was L.S. Lowry, who painted a lot of kind of industrial scenes around Manchester, where I live, actually, and Salford and Manchester, I should say. But he but I didn't want it to look like that. I just wanted it to capture that kind of feel of the kind of hustle and bustle of like an industrial setting. So yeah, there were a few touchstones that I put in there when I was talking to Alec about the art, but I also really wanted it to be his creation as well.
Mm-hmm. I think that's very important because I imagine that you, as a designer, you have your own concept and you tell the illustrator your idea, but the illustrator is going to communicate that in his own words, or rather his own images. I actually wanted to talk about that, of the failed careers. How did you come up with that concept of being these failed backgrounds for the characters?
So so Electric Bastionland sort of followed on from Into the Odd. So I said how in Into the Odd I had these starter packages that when you rolled up your character, you sort of looked up your ability scores against your HP and on this grid, and that gave you like 3 or 4 pieces of equipment. And sometimes they would like hint at a background, but it wouldn't say like you were a sailor, but your equipment might say, oh, well, you get a pistol and a spyglass and a net. And then you kind of might think, well, my background is going to be something in that area, but it was left very much up to the player to decide what sort of background your character has, if you even want to think about that. But for Electric Bastionland, I liked that idea of starter packages, but I wanted to experiment with blowing it up so that instead of just getting a few items, you got like a whole spread, like a 2-page spread that had like a nice big piece of artwork and a very specific sort of background that's tied to the setting, and like a few options for equipment. So you could get the same failed career multiple times and not have like a duplicate. And this really came about the idea of it being a failed career came out at the same time that I decided that the character should start with a huge debt, because in Electric Bastion, I wanted the characters to be like treasure hunters, like in Into the Odd, and I wanted to say like, well, you decided to go out be treasure hunters, like that's the conceit of the game. But I thought, well, why? What's going to be the driving force behind this? And starting characters with a huge debt and somebody that's chasing them down for that debt, it's a huge like driver for them to do something, but it leaves it very open as to what they do, because they know they need to get rich quick, or they could maybe just try and deal with the person who they owe money to. They could try and take them out. But yeah, the idea of having a failed career, I thought was a nice balance there, where it connected to your debt. And also it meant that if you rolled a career that you didn't really like, it doesn't matter because it's a failed career. So that's not what you do anymore. So if you rolled some like sailor career, but you thought, well, I don't want my character to be that, it doesn't matter because your character is now doing something new. This is about what they're doing now. But their background still kind of gives them just like some equipment and maybe an ability or two. So yeah, it kind of all came from there. And I wanted these characters to be the way that I presented the setting as well. I didn't want players to have to read through a load of stuff about the setting in order to know what was going on. I kind of liked the idea that as you rolled the characters, if you had 4 different characters, it would just hint at 4 different sort of things about the world. And sort of if you just look at those 4 characters, it almost tells you about the world just by doing character creation, which is something that you're going to do anyway. And yeah, I'm really happy with that. It took a long time to write 100 failed careers, but I'm really happy with how that one turned out.
Yeah, and I think that everyone will appreciate that because there is so much room for creativity, fun when it comes to enjoying Electric Bastionland or Into the Odd. And sometimes I think that some games push aside the fun part. So it's very important for you to enjoy the experience itself. Now, please tell us about the setting. How did you come up with the city of Bastion? What was the spark for that?
Well, to start with, when I first started designing Into the Odd, it was very much, this is my hack of D&D, and this is what I'm going to use to play D&D modules and like stuff that people were making in like the OSR space. And I wasn't really thinking about a setting. I was thinking more about the rules and how I wanted the game to play. And then from there, I thought, well, I'll just put on the bare minimum of setting that means that you can plug an existing module into that world without any real trouble. So I thought, well, I want there to be like an underground, like one big underground that stretches across the whole world. And that's where you can put all the dungeons if you need to put a dungeon in the world. And I thought, well, I want there to be there were originally multiple cities that had like different kind of, each one had its own kind of little gimmick. But then I thought, well, no, if you go into the city in a game of like D&D, you're kind of going to the city. So I thought, well, what if I push them all together? And it's this huge city that has all of these cool ideas from 4 cities that I was working on, and just crush them together so that they're all in one place. And it means that any kind of idea you have for like an urban setting, you can put it somewhere in this giant city. And it all kind of just came out of that, where I wanted to create these places that you could put adventures. And as I started to sort of work on I started to write about it on my blog and release sort of versions of the game, people actually got quite interested in the setting and were asking for like more information about it, which was something I wasn't expecting. And it just sort of rolled out from there. And things like making it, rather than it being kind of a medieval or Renaissance kind of world, it's much more industrial, and kind of like there's gunpowder and there's, you know, steam power and things like that. And the reason I went down that route is with Into the Odd, I wanted it to be a bit more of a horror element to it. And I always feel like it's easier to make some things seem scary if you've got a more relatable normal element in the world. So if a character is relatable, and so in that they're a normal person, sorry, if they kind of look like a normal person today with like a job, and they, the point that I'm trying to make is a medieval world is already so alien to us in the sort of 21st century that I feel like it's sometimes difficult to make those things relatable. Whereas setting things in kind of the late industrial kind of setting, it's a bit more of a relatable world to what we know today. So you can make those weird horror elements feel a little bit more close to home. And yeah, so every kind of element of the setting came out of something that I wanted to do with the game, rather than having this kind of vision for, oh, this is my world and this is my creation. It all came out of actual sort of the needs of the game, rather than from anywhere else.
I think that's perfect because it ties very well with the original role-playing game concept of Dave Arneson. Did you ever know why the whole going into dungeons thing started?
Was it something to do with like a castle siege or something?
More or less, Dave Arneson had his players going into this castle, but they were clearing out every room in the castle. And he was like, where can I take them to have further adventures? Well, we go down. We go down.
That's it.
Yeah. Now, when it comes to the threats, the enemies, the horrors that you can encounter in Into the Odd or Electric Bastionland, did you have some sort of, what's your main source of inspiration? Because you can find aliens and some like parodies of real creatures, mutations, and all of that. Tell us about that.
So with Into the Odd, I was a bit more inspired by horror and sci-fi rather than fantasy for this one, because aside from anything else, I felt like there were just a lot of games with fantasy monsters. So I thought, well, I don't want to do another dragon and another troll necessarily. Like I still enjoy playing with those monsters, but I thought I don't want that to be the sort of example monsters in this game. So in the kind of sample adventure that's in Into the Odd, there's just lots of weird things that were inspired by things from horror films and things from sci-fi films. And things from just weird things from online. Like, I don't know if you know the SCP. Like,
yes,
yeah, like a lot of those things are really good monsters because they're kind of like weird trick monsters that have they're like super powerful in a very specific way, but they're kind of limited as well. And I always like those monsters that you have to kind of figure out. Like the Rust monster is the classic example of it's super powerful in a very specific way. But yeah, the sample monsters in Into the Odd are pretty obviously. There's like a predator in there, and there's an alien in there, and they're sort of slightly reskinned so that it's not quite so obvious. But I wanted the sample monsters to be more of a here's what you can make, rather than here are the official monsters of this setting. So they're presented more as sort of an idea to get the GM to sort of see how they can make different types of monsters. So like, here's how you can make a monster that can't be hurt, and here's how you can make a monster that's super powerful in combat, and here's how you can make one that's like got sort of magical powers. There's like this dust witch in there. So yeah, I always wanted always loved the idea of people being inspired to make their own monsters, because that's the thing that I always wanted to do with D&D. Like, I remember getting 3rd edition D&D and loving the monster manual, but thinking like, right, I'm going to make my own monsters in 3rd edition D&D. And there was like a whole system for it, but you had to go through this system, and it felt like it was fun in its own way to do on your own, but you would never want to do it quickly at the table. If I realized I wanted something at the table, it would have been very difficult to make it up on the fly. So yeah, I loved the idea of making monsters simple enough that you could kind of just improvise them at the table if you needed rules for that kind of monster right there.
Have you been running into the Odd and Electric Bastionland a lot of times lately?
At the moment, I've been, to be honest, most of the time I get to play. At the moment, I'm busy testing the next thing, because I've always got something else that I want to test. And I've been trying to make more of an effort to play other role-playing games, because the problem is when you get in the habit of making your own, I want to make sure I don't completely remove myself from being able to play other games, because I think it's very important to have that reference when you're designing stuff, but also it's just it can sort of spark something that you hadn't necessarily thought of. And I do like stealing things from other people's games. So to be honest, I have played Electric Bastionland and Into the Odd. I think I played them both this year at some point. But yeah, it's been much more about testing the next thing and trying out a few other systems as well.
Of all of the games that you have run, or perhaps even actual plays that you have seen, have you identified something that people really like about those odd settings? Like, oh, I love the crazy encounters, or oh, I love that my character has this weird thing or that.
I think it's one of the things that people tend to enjoy is I always like watching, because to be honest, I have a very short attention span, so I sometimes struggle to watch actual plays. If I see someone's done like an Into the Odd actual play and it's like 3 hours long, I always think I'm not really going to be able to watch all of this because I'm going to lose attention. But the thing that I always go and watch is the character creation, because like I said, that's everyone's first taste of the game. And I think if your game has a painful character creation process, it's very difficult to make the rest of the game fun. But I always love, especially with Electric Bastionland, I always love watching people roll characters, because it's that moment when they roll to see which career they get. And in fact, before that, they're rolling for their ability scores, and someone always rolls terribly and says, oh, I've got 1 hit point and 5 strength. And that can go both ways. Some people really don't like that, but if people take that in the spirit it's intended, it's always fun to see. And then when they get to their failed career, it's always fun to see when someone opens the book and they're laughing before they've said what they've got, because there are some strange ones in here. Like there's one where you can be a dog. There's one where you're identical twins, so you split your character in 2. There's a career where you're a bunch of street urchins that kind of each hit point is a separate street urchin, and yeah, there are more sort of human ones as well, but there's a lot of weird stuff in there, and I always love seeing that part of an actual play. But the other thing that I do get as feedback is just that I think I think even people that don't think they like rules like games, at the right time, I think everybody always likes rules like games at the right time, if that makes sense. So even if you like a really heavy game, it can be a nice change to play a rules like game, to approach it kind of differently. So I've had quite a few people that say they like really crunchy, heavy games, but they played Into the Odd and they really enjoyed it for the kind of rules like quick, fast experience. And they'll say, oh, I can't believe we played for 90 minutes and we got through 20 rooms in the dungeon. And they were like, and then I went back and played another game, and it took me 2 hours to get through one encounter. So yeah, that kind of hearing people who you wouldn't normally expect to like that kind of system, hearing good feedback from them is always really good to see.
Yes, I personally think that there should be like a balance when you enjoy tabletop RPGs. Sometimes you want to enjoy crunchier systems, other times you should go rules light, because that way you understand like both points of view.
Yeah.
When it comes to that, is there a tabletop RPG quite different from Into the Odd or Electric Bastionland that you really like? Something that you haven't designed yourself?
So the one the thing is with RPGs, I tend to like I like rules light games that do rules light well, and I like rules heavy games that do rules heavy well. I think you can do both of them badly, but if you do it well, I kind of like both sides of it. One, it's not strictly an RPG, but a game that I got into last year is BattleTech, the miniatures game. And that game is in many ways it's not that complicated, but when you start learning it and you start trying to teach it to the person, it's super complicated because you're talking about, you've got your battle mech that you're piloting, and you've got to worry about heat and all these specific locations, and each individual part of your armor is tracked, and you've got all these different modifiers to attacking and moving on different terrains, and there's a lot of charts going on. And when I got it, I think I bought it mainly for the miniatures. I bought like the starter set, and I thought, well, I'm going to read this because it's I was thinking it was some relic of a bygone age, and it was this old system that I was going to hate. But if you go into it in the right frame of mind, it's just a lot of fun tracking all that stuff. It makes you feel like you are kind of trying to pilot this giant robot that has all these moving parts and all these controls, and you have to worry about which bits of your armor have fallen off, and you've got to think about every step of movement that you take. And I wouldn't necessarily want that in an RPG. I think I like that in a game. I like that kind of detail when the game is about that kind of detail. I think the problem with RPGs is when I sit down to play an RPG, I often want more of that. Like you said, the idea that you can do anything, and the idea that you could find these weird items, like you could find like a wish spell, or you could find a rust monster that is this weird puzzle monster. I don't really want to worry about how many steps I'm taking this way or which part of the body I'm hitting with my sword. So I think different types of rule system can work if it's the right system for that scenario, if that makes sense.
Yes, because there's actually BattleTech tabletop RPG. I don't know if you have played that one.
I've not played it. I have the book back there somewhere. There's several. There's it's very confusing, but Destiny is the one I have, which I think is the newer one. But I gather there was another one that was incredibly complicated. But that sounds that might be a bridge too far for me.
Yes, it definitely has to catch the attention of the player, as you said. If your player is mostly focused on the mechanical side and they forget the role play, they are focused completely on the game system and toss away the role play, that freedom. Yes, it can distort the experience for some. Now, when it comes to major, is there like a movie or anime or cartoon that also influenced your design process?
There's lots of little things thrown in there. There's not really one big thing that sort of inspired me for Electric Bastionland and Into the Odd, certainly. There wasn't like one big thing. The thing that people always tell me, they say for Electric Bastionland, they say, oh, this is clearly inspired by the film Brazil by Terry Gilliam. And I'd heard this so many times, and I'd never seen this film. I didn't really even know anything about it. I knew Terry Gilliam, obviously, but I didn't know Brazil really as a film. People kept telling me Electric Bastionland is just the Brazil RPG. So I thought, well, okay, I will I will eventually watch it. And years after Electric Bastionland came out, I thought, well, you know what? Today I'm going to sit and watch this Brazil film. And it is actually a really good fit. So it's so weird that there's lots of stuff in there. As I was watching it, I thought, I can absolutely see how somebody thinks that I watched this, and then that's where everything from Electric Bastionland came from. But really, I think, like I said, because I think I absorb a lot of stuff secondhand, it's more of just a mix of lots of different ideas and just lots of things that I see and think about in my daily life. So, for instance, when I wrote Electric Bastionland, I just moved to the city that I live in now. I previously lived in quite a sort of rural area, but I moved to a relatively big city in the UK. And a lot of the stuff that made its way into Electric Bastionland, because it's a very urban setting, a lot of that stuff was just like weird things that I would see around the city that I live in, and sort of think, well, that was kind of weird. How could I make it even weirder? Or just like normal little scenarios, like I'm always slightly obsessed with, this is a slightly weird thing, but when you walk past like a shop on a high street in a town, and there's often like a flat or an office or something above, and I always think that it's kind of strange that you get like some strange combinations where you think, well, it must be particularly strange to live above certain types of shop because of the sounds and smells and experience that you get. So one of the things that made its way into Electric Bastionland is the idea that every building is shared by at least kind of 3 purposes. So every shop you go into also has somebody kind of living there, and it also has like a civic purpose, and perhaps there's like it might lead into a park, and just this kind of cramming together of everything. So it's very much a mess of ideas rather than kind of drawing from any one particular source.
Now, when it comes to running the games, are you a fan of using tools such as typical dice, cards, bennies, maps, miniatures? What are your thoughts on those tools, those aids?
So I tend to keep things very simple, mainly because I almost don't, because I play a lot with sort of new people who perhaps don't play a lot of RPGs or might have not played an RPG before. I kind of don't want to daunt them by bringing out this huge pile of stuff and saying this is the game, and these huge character sheets. I always want to kind of lead with the idea of, oh yeah, well, we'll just describe what's happening, and then we might roll some dice to determine what happens. So I do keep things very simple. I occasionally, I went through a phase of using like a whiteboard battle map that had like a grid on it, and I would kind of very quickly sketch like just the shape of sort of the room that they were in if there was like a combat happening, and then use just some colored counters to say, well, you're here, you're there, you're there. But I found even that was slightly distracting people from what was happening in the fiction, because they were then looking at this map rather than imagining the space. And it's tricky. I do find that stuff useful for more complex situations where you kind of need to know who is precisely in which position, if it's a combat where that matters. But no, for the most part, I do tend to just go with dice, pen and paper, and that's kind of it, really. I do miniature gaming as well, and for miniature gaming, I like having terrain and all these big set pieces. But I feel like, again, for RPGs, that's not what I go to an RPG for. If I want to see a little miniature world on the table, I'll play a miniature game. And if I'm playing an RPG, I kind of want to be more focused on what we're talking about and describing what's happening.
Mm-hmm. So you could say that you initiate others into the hobby, right? Because you are presenting people that perhaps never played RPGs before. You can show them the ropes.
Well, yeah, I mean, so like I said, I have quite a few friends who we grew up together, and quite a few of my friends played miniature games because, you know, Warhammer was everywhere here. But they never really played RPGs, so I do occasionally play with them, and it's rare enough that it always feels like I'm sort of reinitiating them into it. I do play with I have like a few groups that are like regular players who will play, you know, have played a lot of RPGs. But some of the most fun games I've had have been, there's like a games club near me here where I'll occasionally go there, and it's mainly a board games meetup, but they do occasionally, people will run RPGs there. And I've gone and I've run Electric Bastionland there for people who have sort of said, oh yeah, well, I come to this board game thing every week, but I've never played an RPG. And playing with those people, it's so interesting because they come to it with a completely different sort of set of preconceptions. And often it's really good because they come into it and they might have heard about things. So they'll ask about something like experience points, and I'll say, oh, that's not how it works in this game. And they'll ask about something else, and I'll say, oh no, this game, you don't need to worry about that. And it's interesting because sometimes they seem disappointed that they're not getting the D&D experience that they've heard of through like popular culture, but sometimes they look incredibly relieved, and they're sort of like, oh, so I don't have to worry about all this. And you say no, and you say, well, do I have to do silly voices? And you say, no, you don't have to do a silly voice if you don't want to. You can do what you want. And those people, it's really fun to play with them and see them getting into it and see them exploring something that they were perhaps a little bit scared about. And some of those players have been like the most creative, fun players that I've played with. It's been great.
Mm-hmm. I can definitely see how things proceed like that, because there are a lot of people that perhaps have some misconceptions about tabletop RPGs. Now, I'm curious, have you ever played a Diceless or a system that requires no tools whatsoever?
Yeah, I've played. So this was during one of the COVID lockdowns here. I started doing my stream, and I was looking for sort of things to do on my stream, and I had seen Wander Home by J Dragon, and Wander Home it's dice. Well, you can play it a number of different ways, but I think it's always diceless, and it's usually GMless, and you can play it solo. So I thought, well, this is like nothing I've played before. So I'm going to play a game that's a solo game with no GM and no dice. There is barely a system where you can to do certain actions. You have to take a token from a pool, and then you can spend that token to do something else. But to be honest, that system is barely kind of there, and it's mostly just choosing things from lists. And I really enjoyed the experience of it, and I would love to play in that game with a group and see how it feels. For me, it does scratch a slightly different itch because it feels a bit more like a sort of creative writing exercise almost, which is fun. But I think I did slightly miss that randomness of RPGs, because I love things like random tables. I love things like when you roll and you get a really unlikely result, so everyone at the table starts laughing. I love that tension of sort of taking a risk on something. So I think I enjoy those things, but I would not be looking to sort of give up dice anytime soon.
I just came up with a really good idea, but before that, what can you tell us about immersion? What is your conception or idea about immersion in tabletop RPGs?
So I think for me, immersion is, I know for some players it's like super important to be like super immersed, and some groups like to sort of everyone's in character all the time. For me, I kind of sit in the middle, because I guess the other extreme is you have players who play in, I've heard it described as war game mode, where you're much more just saying, well, I want my guy to move there and do this. And you're not speaking in like the first person. You're just saying, well, I'm going to move my guy to there. They're going to do this and then this. And you're very detached from it. And I think it's easy to look at either way as being like right or wrong. And I don't think that war game style is necessarily less immersive. I think it's just different ways that different people engage with it. I think I often play in that kind of style of being quite detached from my character, but like I'm still what's going on, and I'm still immersed in my own way, even though it might not look like I'm sort of like super immersed. But then on other days, I do quite enjoy, like I said, doing the silly voices and trying to sort of do it as a bit more of a kind of, not quite a performance, but like a shared kind of role play thing. So I think I can go all different ways on it, but I think they're just kind of different types of immersion. And the thing for me is if you're picturing that scenario, and if you're thinking, well, what would my character do in this situation? It doesn't need to be that you're thinking on a really deep level about this character's emotions and their background. It could just be, what would my character do? What's the best thing my character can do right now? And I think that still counts as immersion for me. So I think I enjoy having all those different types of immersion sort of at different times.
Yes, because that's part of the challenge in tabletop RPGs. You want to win the game, but you also want to do things that are expected of your characters, of the persona or the avatar, however you want to look at it. Now, when it comes to being a player or a game master, what would you consider yourself to be? Like, you have played equal times as a player or as a game master, or you feel like, oh, I am the forever game master or the forever player or something like that?
I think I'm probably like the 80% GM. So I GM most of the time, and for a while I was a GM pretty much all the time. But I found more people now who I can play with who that they will run a game quite happily, and I like that. That's about the right ratio for me, because I do enjoy being a player. In some ways, I find being a player is almost more daunting, because when I'm running a game, I've done it enough now that I feel relatively comfortable doing it, and I feel like you've got a degree of control, and I kind of know what my job is. But when you're a player, your job, if you like, is a little bit more vague, because you've got to share it with all these other people at the table, and you don't want to overstep things for the GM. And sometimes, and like you say, you can have the rest of the group are wanting to play in a slightly different way. Like you've got the one player who's very role playing and the other player who's sort of playing it in kind of the war game stuff. So I've had a few times when I've played as a player and I've come away from the session really exhausted and drained, just because it can be a little bit more uncertain for me and a bit more stressful. So I would probably choose to be a GM over a player the vast majority of the time, which is weird because you think that would be more exhausting. But I think because I've done it enough now, it's a more comfortable experience for me, and it is one of the things that I love doing in the game. I don't see it as a burden to be the GM. I see it as sort of it's a real like part of the game for me. It's not just this thing that I have to do. I love sort of coming up with dungeons and running the game and coming up with these sort of surprises for the players.
It's interesting that you mentioned stress. What would you consider to be the most stressful thing about being a player and the most stressful thing about being a game master?
I think when I've been a player, the thing that is most stressful is when when you're running a game. If I'm a game master and I feel like something's not right at the table, like we're not all on the same page, as a GM, you can kind of bring that all together because that's in your control. But when you're just a player, and you can tell that the GM wants a certain type of game and the players want a slightly different type of game, it's a very awkward situation to resolve sometimes, because you don't want to say stop to the GM and then try and because you're never sure if you're imagining it as well. It might just be me. So those are the situations that I find very stressful as a player. Those kind of times when you almost want to do more, but you don't want to overstep the line with the GM. In terms of running a game, things that have been stressful, I don't find it that stressful because the other thing is I try not to put too much pressure on myself as the GM, and I try to be very honest about this stuff with players. Like if the players, because I have friends who will try and sort of, in a friendly way, they will try and annoy me when we're playing a game sometimes. So they will say something like, there's clearly I've planned a certain dungeon for the night. And I say, well, we're going in there and you're at the front door of the dungeon. And they'll say, well, what if I want to just go back there and do this other thing? And I will tell them, we can do that, but I'll be making it up. And it probably won't be very good. Whereas if you go into this dungeon, there is stuff that is going to be very good and very fun. And I think being open and honest with your players about that sort of thing, and not trying to be, the genius behind a curtain where everything is perfectly concealed at all times. I think it's okay to be honest and say, oh, wait, can we stop for a second because I need to look something up? Or say, actually, I'm not sure how this rule works. Let me just double check it. You guys talk amongst yourselves while I look this up. I think lowering the pressure on yourself does help a lot with that. And there was definitely a time when I wanted to try and do everything perfectly, but I think it's better to be open about that from the start, I think.
I think that's why session 0 is so important. Although in my case, session 0 is 15 minutes before the game. Just getting everyone into, okay, this is what we are going to do. You are going to be playing as these characters that are ruin explorers, so they want to explore ruins. There is no reason whatsoever for you to just head into a random direction, keep on walking. Just like in real life, we have objectives. We go to our jobs, we go to the store, etc. We are not just walking. You could walk in a direction. Eventually, you're going to bump with a building or whatnot. But there is always a purpose behind your actions. And there are going to be limitations. Even though I am free to do everything that I want, there are going to be limitations. I can run in a straight line and eventually I'm going to hit a wall or I'm going to bump into someone. So I think it's important for the players to consider that. Now, I'm going to propose a little experiment, if you are willing to do it. Would you like to run a mini RPG encounter right now, Diceless, displaying the sort of situations that you could encounter in Into the Odd? Of course, I would be the game master to display a couple of things, and you could be the player. How about that, Chris? Are you willing to do
let's
it?
do it. Sure.
Okay. Well, first, let's create your character without writing anything. Just tell me your character concept.
Oh, see, you're scaring me because, like I said, I always do some kind of random element with my character. Let me think. Let's
or be random with your thoughts.
Yeah, this is it. Well,
randomly.
I'm really trying to not look around the. In fact, I'm going to choose a thing that I can see on my table as a bit of inspiration, but I'm not going to tell you what it is. Okay, so this character is a. So if we're in Electric Bastionland, this character is. I guess their failed career is they worked at a distillery, and they were a distillery. I guess they were like the host of like the tasting room at the distillery.
Is there like a particular weapon that he or she uses? Something.
Yeah, I guess if he works as security, kind of an imposing weapon, so maybe like a kind of not quite a halberd, but like some sort of like polearm that it's mostly meant to look intimidating because he's security. He's not necessarily a fantastic fighter, but his job is to look serious enough that nobody starts any fights or tries to steal anything from the distillery.
And that's perfect. There's going to be a lot of freedom in this encounter, but here's the catch for running this encounter. You're going to be describing your actions, but you cannot ask questions to the game master. Everything, you're going to obtain it through roleplay. If you want to know the color of something, I pick up the object and look at its color. Or if you want to see a message, I look at the message or the signboard to read its contents. So everything through roleplay. If you want to remember something, I think back to see if I recognize that face. Everything through roleplay because the game master is not going to be there. It's you on the game world on your own. Great. And because this is going to be Diceless, everything is going to be based on the context. If you describe something like, I stab with my halberd at the enemy's torso, then based on the enemy and my interpretation of that, I'm going to give you the results. For this particular encounter, let's make it as a premise that in your distillery job, you encounter this ancient parchment with a map, and the map leads towards this swamp area outside of the city of Bastion. It's called, let's call it, the Yellow Swamp of Forgotten Industry. You know quite well that this is a place of rumors, legends, lies. It is a swamp that hides beneath its waters the buildings of a bygone age that seem to have been at one time refineries or some sort of building to construct machines that are not understandable in current days. But the map indicates that there is a mysterious stone archway in the middle of the swamp. So without telling anyone, you head into the swamp to see where that archway leads or what is going on about that archway that you have never seen before, apart from that map. And so it begins. You find yourself in the middle of the swamp. The waters are just above your knees. You are surrounded by the wreckage and ruins of strange buildings. In front of you, there is a stone archway covered in strange lines and patterns. And there are two small red spheres the size of lemons.
Okay, so I will approach the red spheres and just look at.
Find yourself doubting yourself, thinking about the future that you will do things, but you are in the present. You do things in the present.
Yeah. Okay, I walk to the toward the red spheres and examine them a little bit more closely.
You see that the red spheres are slightly separated from the archway. They almost seem to be hovering on top of the strange glyphs and lines.
Okay, I look over the glyphs and lines and see if any of them resemble any letters or symbols or characters that I might know.
Their meaning is unfathomable. You have never seen such markings before.
Okay, I move forward through the archway and look at the other side of the archway.
As soon as you do just that, you catch a glimpse of the spheres vibrating for a moment, but nothing happens at all.
Okay, so I look further into the beyond the archway and see what is through there.
There is nothing except the yellowish waters of the swamp. There are a few bubbles here and there.
Okay. So heading back through the archway, I will take my not quite halberd. Sorry, I will not do that. I do take my halberd, and perhaps with the blunt end, spinning it round and give the not the actual orb itself, but just the archway sort of next to the orb, give it a bit of a tap to see if the orb responds to this sort of tap tap next to it.
As soon as you tap the orb, by itself, it moves slightly above, and with a small vroom, a sound, it brightens, almost blindingly so, and the other orb or sphere almost vibrates at the same time, but it remains in place.
So as that orb is vibrating, I move and tap the other orb with the blunt end of the halberd.
The same thing happens. It moves just like the other orb. It moves into place. They are now in parallel alignment. They start to shine, and then they go off. And between the archway, a screen of purplish light comes to be. And a strange being, which looks like a muscular male human with a single loincloth, but no head. Instead of a head, it has two appendages that resemble rat tails. It takes a step through the portal, facing you.
I take up a guard position with my halberd and take a step back from the creature and watch to see what it does.
This strange being takes a couple of steps into the swampy water. It now faces the archway, and with his two hands, points towards the archway.
I confidently stride through the archway.
The moment you pass through, you find yourself in a world quite alien when compared to your own. All of the plants, the vegetation, are made of bones. The trees, the bushes, they seem to be human. Other bones seem to be composed of something completely different. And you hear shouting, what seems to be the sound of a woman screaming in the distance through the foliage.
I head towards the sound of the screaming to see if I can see the source of the screams.
As you approach that place, a woman of purple skin and hair like vines runs towards you. She places her hands on your shoulders and starts to speak in the language that you have never heard before. And this is where the encounter ends. I think that was perfect.
Great.
I think we achieved a level of immersion that was quite palpable. And what do you think about this sort of encounter happening in Electric Bastionland? Would it be something common?
I think so. In Electric Bastionland, there is mention of this. So there's a few elements of the setting that do get some description, but the one sort of area of the setting that doesn't really get expanded on is the living stars, which is where there are alien creatures that live in Bastion, and they're described as coming from the living stars. And there are a few hints about what that could be, but it's deliberately left very open. And part of the idea of that is that, yeah, if you've got an idea for a strange world of your own and you want to have the characters go through a portal to get there, it could very easily exist in the living stars. So yeah, I think that could definitely fit.
And what do you think about this Diceless way of handling things?
I think it's like I said, I think it's in many ways it is much more in a good way, it's much more demanding of the players. It really means you have to think about what you're doing, and you can't just approach it in a casual way. Which, like I say, it depends on the mood that you're in. I think on certain times this game would be like that sort of style is too much for me, and it's asking too much of my creativity. But another, if everybody is on the right page and if everybody is, feeling good about it, I think it could definitely make for a really fun game.
I am quite impressed with the way that you role played. Not there are people that, well, they get into the hobby for many reasons, but they don't understand the essence of describing your actions. Because with Electric Bastionland, with the dice, you can also do that. You can describe your attacks. You can make your roll. I really like the combat system, how you deal damage, and the armor reduces the damage, but it happens very fast. And I think the immersion that you can obtain with Electric Bastionland or Into the Odd, however you want to play it. Although I would recommend using dice because I really like the dice system in Electric Bastionland and Into the Odd. I think it is going to provide a lot of adventures, campaigns for the players. That's one of the things I didn't like of Into the Odd of the examples. You had the game master the players were constantly asking questions to the game master, and I always felt like the magic was lost. Personally speaking, I felt like the magic was lost. So I thought, if only they had role played that instead of asking the game master, because I started to feel as if you had like a game master floating in the world, and you had the players instead of the player characters interacting with this world.
Yeah. Well, in the book I'm working on now, Mythic Bastionland, there's actually a large section in that book that is like an extended example of play, where there's going to be multiple pages where each page has one column of example of play, and then the second column is sort of my commentary on that example of play. So talking about ways that the GM could have done things differently, ways that what I liked about what they did and what I didn't like about what they did. And yeah, I always want to provide examples that aren't prescriptive. So it's not like this is the one way to play the game. It's more, this is how this one example has gone, and now I'm going to talk about the other ways that you could do it, or why they might have done it that way. So yeah, I understand that completely, and hopefully the next book will have a bit more of that sort of thing in there.
I highly recommend that you include that with description, because it ties very well with the original Dave Arneson concept of role-playing games. I think people are going to fall in love with Electric Bastionland, Mythic Bastionland, of course, and Into the Odd. But yes, definitely very, very impressed with the way that you role-play the entire situation. I also think that it's important for people that if you mess up, your character dies. That's it. Or your character is injured. Nothing is going to happen. It's the character. So go ahead and interact with the game world. It's there. Now, before we conclude this interview, do you have some other important words about Electric Bastionland, Into the Odd, or anything about tabletop RPGs, etc.?
I think, like you said about using dice with Into the Odd, or whether you could run it without dice. I think, whereas I have spent quite a lot of time and effort trying to make the dice stuff work and make it so that those dice things, the dice elements of the game, add to it, and they create these unexpected scenarios. I always think that it's easy to overestimate how much effect the dice have on the game, because the dice system is important, but what makes the game what it is so much stuff on top of that. So I always like to have a game that has as few rules as possible and then as much stuff as possible afterwards. So I think you could definitely. I'd be really interested to hear if you do get to try running Electric Bastionland or Into the Odd with a sort of diceless system, because I think even if you take away all the rules, it's still Electric Bastionland and it's still Into the Odd. There's still more of that game left if you take those things out.
And because it is a role-playing game, it's important for the players to understand that even though you have dice, you can always have the roleplay influence the result. If someone comes with a really good description of an attack or a way of solving some situation, puzzle, you can always add those modifiers. Oh, you obtain a +3 to your roll because of that.
Yeah.
Well, Thank you so much, Chris, for your time, for answering our questions. The interview proceeded quite smoothly. I thought this is going to take perhaps 2 hours because there are some complex concepts, but you talked about everything excellently. Thank you so much. And
Thank you.
I will definitely let you know if I run perhaps an actual playoff into the other Electric Bastionland one of these days. Curiously enough, in this next Monday, we're going to be playing, because you mentioned SCP, we're actually going to play a horror one-shot featuring the back rooms. Are you familiar with the back rooms?
Yeah.
I actually ran this before, but none of the players survived. Rather, the player characters did not survive.
Sure.
I'm going to send the link to you if you're curious just about that one shot. But yes, this is Monday. I'm going to run it. I would invite you, but I think it's going to be too late in UK time because we're playing at 8 p.m. I think that's like 3 in the morning.
Yeah, no, I'm too old to be up that late.
But if you are open, maybe later on in a month or so, if you play online, let me know and I'll consider you for inviting you for actual plays and whatnot.
Yeah, great.
Okay, well, once again, thank you, Chris, and thank you so much to those that have been watching this interview. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any comments or questions, please let us know in the comment section. If anyone else wishes to further support the channel, the information will also be below. I'm also going to put links to Chris's YouTube channel. He talks about Electric Bastionland, this war game. What's the name of this war game that you were playing the other day?
Was it Mac Attack, the mech game?
I think so.
The Doomed is the other one as well. That's the
Doom,
yeah,
solo.
Doomed.
A solo. That one looks pretty cool.
Yeah.
So please check out his channel, his website. And as always, remember, it is better to roleplay and fail in character than not to roleplay and fail as a player. Thanks again, Chris.
Cheers. Thank you.
I'm going to stop the recording in 10 seconds.